That was beautiful, ladies. Everything that Jesus did proclaimed him to be the Son of God. His power and authority were revealed from the time he turned water into wine until he, just before his crucifixion, chased all the money changers out of the temple for the second time. Just think about all the things that Jesus did that displayed his Godhead, his power and authority. You probably will remember that the temple court was a big place. It was about the size of 15 football fields. Thousands of people could be in that big a space. And you remember Jesus went in there and by himself drove out the money changers, the sheep herders, the cattle traders, and his authority was so great that even the temple guards ran, the priests themselves ran. He emptied the courtyard. Power, authority. And then you remember that one time Jesus and the disciples were in a little boat, and they were out in the middle of the sea, and a storm came up, and it looked like the boat was going to sink. And Jesus had been asleep. The disciples woke him up, and Jesus said, "Peace, be still." And the wind and waves stopped. You remember the Bible says the disciples looked at him and said, "What kind of a man is this, that even the wind and the waves obey him?" And of course, everybody remembers the time when he fed 5,000 men, plus women and children, with the little boy's lunch. 2 loaves, two fish and 5 loaves. Get it right here. 2 fish and 5 loaves. And after thousands of people ate, they had 12 baskets of leftovers. People were so amazed at his authority and power that they said, "This has got to be our king." And they tried to they were going to make him their king right there on the spot. Well, that same evening, Jesus sent the disciples home, told them to go to the other side of the lake, and he stayed and dispersed the crowd. Well, you remember the disciples got out in the middle of the lake, and another storm came up. So much so that the disciples couldn't steer the boat, couldn't go anywhere. It was bad news for the disciples. And guess what Jesus did? Walked on the water. Hey, what kind of a man can walk on water? He has to have authority and power that's beyond anything we can imagine. When you think of all the miracles he worked, the healings he did, the restoring of sight, making cripples walk, sick well, even leprosy. It's no wonder that Matthew, Mark, and Luke spend most of their Gospels just describing his miracles of healing. That's what captured Matthew, Mark, and Luke's attention primarily, was his great miracles of healing. To them, that showed his authority and power. He must be the Son of God. And probably the greatest demonstration of power and authority was when Jesus resurrected Lazarus, who had been dead 4 days. That should have convinced everyone that this man was more than just a man. He had to be God to raise Lazarus from the dead after 4 days. Looking at the life of Jesus all through those 3.5 years of his public ministry leads us to only one conclusion. He must have been the Son of God. One time Jesus, healed a man who had been born blind. And that created quite a ruckus in Jerusalem. And this man who had been healed was going around praising Jesus, and the scribes and Pharisees didn't like that a bit. And I want to read you what this man who had been born blind, who could now see, what he said about Jesus. It's found in John 9, verses 30 to 33. Doesn't this describe how we all feel this morning about Jesus? The man answered and said to them, "Why, this is a marvelous thing, that you do not know where he's from. Yet he has opened my eyes. Now we know that God does not hear sinners. But if anyone is a worshiper of God and does his will, he hears him. Since the world began, it has been unheard of that anyone opened the eyes of one who had been born blind. If this man were not from God, he could do nothing." If this man were not from God, he could do nothing. He had to be authority. He had to have power. He certainly was God. There is, however, one thing that Jesus did that is totally out of character with everything else he had done. And I want you to think about this one thing that Jesus did that was totally different from all the miracles, all the marvelous manifestations of power and authority that he'd given. It happened on the day before Jesus was crucified. Jesus had gathered with the disciples in an upper room to celebrate Passover. We read about it in Matthew chapter 26, verses 17 to 19. Now on the first day of the Feast of the Unleavened Bread, the disciples came to Jesus, saying to him, "Where do you want us to prepare for you to eat the Passover?" And he said, "Go into the city to a certain man and say to him, 'The teacher says, my time is at hand. I will keep the Passover at your house with my disciples.' So the disciples did as Jesus had directed them, and they prepared the Passover." Remember I said this was just the day before his crucifixion. This was a very special moment for Jesus. And we don't know all the reasons why. Someday we can talk to Jesus and ask him. But this Passover was special. Maybe it was special because at this Passover, Jesus intended to give the church the ceremony of the Lord's Supper. Anyway, it says in Luke chapter 22, verses 15 and 16, that it was a special moment for Jesus. Then he said to them, "With fervent desire, I have desired to eat this Passover with you before I suffer. For I say to you, I will no longer eat of it until it's fulfilled in the kingdom of God." So Jesus and the disciples are gathered in the upper room, and Jesus has said with great desire to meet with them on this Passover and to share with them and to prepare them for his death. Anyway, Jesus realized he had one big problem. Actually, it wasn't his problem. It was the disciples' problem. But it became his problem because Jesus saw something going on among the disciples that would prevent them from carrying on his mission in the world. After 3.5 years of personal instruction, Jesus realized the disciples had missed it. They hadn't caught Jesus' instruction. The Bible describes their problem in Luke 22, verse 24. Luke 22, verse 24. Can you imagine this? After 3.5 years with Jesus, on the day before his crucifixion, it says, "Now there was also a dispute among them as to which of them should be considered the greatest." In other words, brothers and sisters, the disciples were still self-centered. They were selfish men. Each one thought he was better than the others. The root of all sin is selfishness. And after 3.5 years, Jesus realized he had failed. He had failed to help his very closest disciples conquer selfishness. They were all self-centered men, thinking of themselves. Instead of being filled with love, they were filled with self. They are in no spiritual condition to receive the Lord's Supper. They are in no spiritual condition to continue the ministry of Jesus on the earth. What could he do at this late moment to convert his disciples and change them from selfish, self-centered men into loving servants? John chapter 13, verses 3 to 5 tells us. It's amazing. In some respects, more amazing than all the things that Jesus had done that displayed his power and authority. Jesus, knowing that the Father had given all things into his hands, he knew he was full of power and authority. God had given everything into his hands, it says. And then he'd come from God and was going to God. Rose from supper, laid aside his garments, took a towel, girded himself. After that, he poured water into a basin and began to wash the disciples' feet and to wipe them with the towel with which he was girded. The Son of God, creator of heaven and earth, who possessed all power and authority, knelt down as a servant, as a slave, and washed the disciples' feet. It's hard to believe that he actually did that. The last lesson that Jesus gave before his death was a lesson of loving service to others. Jesus then told the disciples in John 13, verses 13 to 15, "You call me teacher and Lord, and you say, well, for so I am. If I then, your Lord and teacher, have washed your feet, you also ought to wash one another's feet. For I have given you an example that you should do as I've done to you." You see, friends, Jesus didn't want the disciples to forget that they were to be loving servants, not selfish, self-centered men. So he told them to do as I've done to you. Periodically, come together and wash each other's feet to remind yourselves that the Christian life is not a selfish life. It's not a self-seeking life. It's a life of loving service. And I believe that's still what Jesus wants us to learn. Stop being selfish, self-centered, thinking of yourself, but give yourself as a minister of loving service. We're having communion service, as you can see. And in the Seventh-day Adventist Church, before we have communion service, we participate in the foot washing ceremony. For our visitors' sake, I just want to inform you that men gather in one place and wash each other's feet. Ladies go to another section and wash each other's feet, separate. And we believe in open communion. You're all welcome to participate. And there probably will be some of you, for various reasons, can't participate in the ordinance of foot washing. I'm getting close to that stage. Not there yet, but I'm getting close, because it's not hard to get down to wash somebody's feet, but it's getting awfully hard for me to get up. Some of you know what I'm talking about. Anyway, in case you don't particularly want to participate in the ordinance of foot washing, we invite you just to remain here in the sanctuary. They'll be playing some soft music while we're washing each other's feet. You're welcome just to stay here and wait until we come back for the Lord's Supper. But if you want to come and just observe, we'd be glad for you to just come and watch if you've never seen it done. If you want to participate, fine, we'd love to have you. But we're going to separate now, and the fellowship hall down to your left as you leave the sanctuary has been set up. We'll go there and we'll wash each other's feet, then we'll come back and partake of the Lord's Supper. And it's our prayer that the ordinance of the Lord's Supper will have the same effect on you that it had upon the disciples of old. That it will destroy self and self-centeredness in your life. And you'll be able to come back to partake of the Lord's Supper, a willing, loving servant of Jesus. Okay, we'll separate now for the ordinance.